Okay, everyone, thank you so much for coming. Welcome back to our next session, which features Luiza Prado de O. I'm very pleased that you're here. Luiza is a very strong voice in the context of the colonial artistic and activist practices, and you can actually see her film As Flames Engulf the River here on this floor in the exhibition, in the festival exhibition. So please, if you haven't watched it yet, please see it, check it out. It's just around the corner. And I'd like to introduce you to Luiza, who will give a presentation, and then we will have the opportunity for a little conversation and, of course, questions. Luiza Prado de O.Martins' work engages with material and visual culture through the lenses of decolonial and queer theories. In her doctoral thesis, she examined technologies and practices of birth control and their entanglements with colonial hierarchies of gender, race, ethnicity, class, and nationality, offering the idea of techno-ecologies of birth control as a framework for observing and intervening in biopolitical articulations emerging around practices of birth control. She holds an MA in digital media from the Hochschule für Künste Bremen and, of course, a PhD, which I already mentioned. And I may also mention that you are the current Willem Flusser resident of the Transmediale Festival in Berlin. So please give a warm welcome to Luiza. Thanks.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here. Thank you, Fabian, and everyone here at PACT for the invitation. So, as Fabian was saying, I'm an artist and a researcher. I'm originally from Brazil, but I've been based in Germany for the past almost 10 years. And in my work, as Fabian was saying, I investigate these tensions between technologies of birth control and bodies through the lenses of feminist, queer, and decolonial theories. In the PhD dissertation that he also mentioned, and which you can download on my website, I analyze how these technologies become articulated in ways that perpetuate the colonial matrix of power. And although it was very useful to do this deep dive into how the control of reproduction is a fundamental feature of coloniality, this was honestly also very emotionally taxing work, because it meant years and years of looking into histories of deep trauma and pain, and years looking into past and present accounts of the exploitation of bodies in the global south and of non-white bodies in the north. So after finishing, I felt I needed to shift my focus a little bit, also because I needed to honestly feel hope. I needed to feel that, particularly given the historical moment we are facing right now, resistance has always existed and will always exist. So for the past year and a half, I've been developing an artistic research project called Topography of Excesses. And in this new project, I examine technologies of birth control in relation to colonial processes of production of race, gender, and sexuality. And this project starts from a kind of a meditation on the excesses that eurocentric conceptions of the body, of knowledge, of community, and of subjectivity attribute to those colonized. And under such definitions, the problems affecting our communities are attributed not to the violent and systematic exploitation established by the colonial project and continued by capitalism, but to faults found within ourselves. We're framed as simultaneously incomplete, lacking the fundamental humanity represented by whiteness, and excessive, too numerous, too sexual, too fertile, too emotional, too much. So starting from these reflections, I propose through this project a reframing of history of sorts, meant to subvert and reject these colonial narratives, looking into this idea of excess, the space of excess, as one of intersection where revolutionary politics can emerge through exchanges, really, and solidarity amongst marginalized peoples and communities. Now, a little bit of background may be useful here. So historically, people of color have been and continue to be exploited for all kinds of labor directly related or adjacent to reproduction and fertility. Consider, for instance, the history of the contraceptive pill. The first source of raw material for synthetic progesterone was the barbasco yam, which was a wild plant that grew in rural regions of Mexico. Syntax, a company founded by a US-American chemist, was the first to commercialize the hormone. And this company developed a whole market around this plant. They maintained Mexican, often indigenous workers who collected and processed this yam in indentured servitude. And the ceaseless hunger for this yam had a dire impact in the environment of Oaxaca, Veracruz, and Puebla. Furthermore, also the scientific contributions to knowledge about the plant that these Mexican workers gave, such as processing and extraction techniques, were actually obscured by the US-American scientists working for the company. They were written out of the history of this plant. And then we get to also the development of the pill itself, which to me illustrates also very well the entanglements between colonial power and reproduction. So the clinical trials necessary for FDA approval were conducted in the island colony of Puerto Rico by scientists John Rock and Gregory Pincus, with support from feminist activists and suffragettes Margaret Sanger and Catherine McCormick. At the time of these trials in the 50s, Puerto Rico was already targeted by a number of US-funded population control programs, operating under the assumption that the poverty affecting the island stemmed from the excessive fertility of Puerto Ricans, not, from centuries of colonial exploitation and enslavement. Sanger and McCormick, often lauded as feminist icons, by the way, agreed that the tests needed to happen and facilitated the scientists' access to what McCormick actually described as a cage of ovulating females. These tests were conducted with no proper consent on people living in slums, mental hospitals, and prisons. Complaints about side effects from depression to strokes were attributed by the scientists, and this is a quote, to the emotional hyperactivity of Puerto Rican women. These side effects, ignored or downplayed for decades, still affect thousands of people who use the pill to this day. Quite an ironic legacy of colonial violence. That's no coincidence, of course. As the colonial scholar Maria Lugones remarks, the cohesion of a colonial modern gender system was fundamental to the establishment and the continuation of the colonial project. She says that all aspects of this gender system are violent, yet they manifest this inherent violence in different ways. Whereas white women were encumbered with perpetuating the white race, non-white people, and particularly women of color, were, quote, understood as animals. It's no surprise then that within this inherently violent hierarchy of bodies, women of color become required, people of color are required to perform all kinds of labor, including reproductive labor, for the benefit of white heteropatriarchy, cis patriarchy too. So the body of work that I've been developing over this past year spans film, text, performance, sculpture, and installation. As I mentioned, focusing on this colonial violence that I just described, exerted over racialized bodies, was a hard task. So with this project, with a topography of excesses, I decided to focus on histories and knowledges about herbal birth control remedies in Brazil. Now, abortion is something that to this day is illegal in Brazil, and not only illegal, it is also shrouded by intense stigmatization. People don't even talk about it, which of course is also a function of colonization and subsequent processes of acculturation. Even contraception, even though it is legal, has recently been placed in jeopardy by increasingly strict laws which aim to limit access to medications, fundamental medications like the morning after pill, or devices like the IUD. The Statute of the Unborn, for instance, is a bill that was first proposed in 2005, which attempted to legally define the beginning of life as the moment when an egg is fertilized. It was, of course, a target of massive protests, and subsequently, it was divided into smaller bits that are currently being sneaked into bills, other bills, slowly passed in Congress. Another bill first proposed in 2007 and recently brought back for consideration this year would outlaw the sale of the morning after pill in pharmacies and its prescription in the public healthcare system. And more recently, even in São Paulo State Representative Fernando Holliday proposed a law that would place pregnant people suspected of wanting an abortion in preventative incarceration in mental institutions. These hostile attempts at passing control of one's fertility to external forces, of course, provokes the grievous impacts on those who are already marginalized, those who are poor, those who are targeted by racist violence, including within the public health system already, or those who are targeted by gender-based violence. As a response to those conditions, people develop all sorts of ways of managing fertility, and knowledge about herbal birth control, passed down orally amongst people, is a key part of that. Cinnamon, parsley, papaya, queen anne's lace, rue, peacock flower, all these plants become part of another dimension to knowledge, one in which other futures really are conceived through a practice of what I've been calling radical care, communal care. Now, when I started this project, things were shifting in Brazil. It was the beginning of last year. On March 14, 2018, during the very week when I was conceiving the general framework for a topography of excesses, activist and politician Marielle Franco, you might have heard of her, was executed in my hometown of Rio, actually in the neighborhood where I used to study at. Her killing sent really shockwaves around the country that was already undergoing turmoil for years. The message it sent really was that if Marielle, which was a famous and respected leftist politician, could be executed, what could happen to all other activists? It was a clear message to all activists, all leftists in a country increasingly hostile towards anyone fighting to shift colonial and capital structures that have governed Brazil since the Europeans arrived. But I'm not sure, even with her execution, that at the time we were able to fully capture the magnitude of the problem that we were facing. At that time, Bolsonaro still didn't appear to be a viable candidate. Though he had been garnering followers, he was still mostly a marginal nut job who didn't really have an actual chance at getting elected. Now, as we all know, of course, we were unfortunately, terribly wrong. Throughout this past decade, Brazil has undergone a profound shift towards the right, also as a result of interventionist policies of the United States. In 2013, it started with turmoil, massive unrests, massive protests in the street. These protests were initially quite progressive, but they were very quickly hijacked by the right. In 2016, there was a coup, the removal of President Dilma Rousseff, amongst an increasing hostility towards the left. Targeting of feminists, leftists, LGBTQI activists was on the rise. In 2018, Marielle was murdered. In 2018, Bolsonaro was elected. That same year, the censorship of artists and academics also rose dramatically. Now in 2019, we are 7 months into the Bolsonaro government. Professors are being arbitrarily arrested. There has been a gigantic increase in hate crimes, including crimes openly and specifically committed in his name. And we have also discovered that the Bolsonaro family has ties with the mafias that run many regions of Rio and with Marielle's murderers. We are in a situation where a significant part of the population has chosen to elect a man who had openly advocated for eugenic policies his entire life as a public figure. In this work, which was recently installed at Display Gallery in Prague, I superimpose footage of me ingesting somehow an entire package of birth control pills with Bolsonaro and a lot of his quotes and what he has said about eugenics throughout his career. He has had a consistent history in advocating for the monitoring and the surveilling of fertility of the poorest, most marginalized populations of Brazil, racialized populations of Brazil. And the other images that are here are also images. This one that just showed up, for instance, is part of a series of paintings created by Albert Eckhout when the Dutch were occupying Brazil. Eckhout created a series of paintings that were meant to show the population of Brazil to the European eye. And he created a sort of hierarchy of populations that goes from indigenous peoples who were very hostile to the Dutch and who fought the Dutch, which are presented as dangerous, surrounded by tarantulas and snakes and wild rabbit dogs, to the woman in the white dress, which appears every once in a while, who is called Mestiça woman, and who is seductively hiking up her dress. Another work exhibited recently, also at Display in Prague, and now here at PACT, is this video essay. So in this, I start from an examination of the presence of the peacock flower, also known as ayowiri, in the proximity of the Marechal Zanobi da Costa military police battalion in the district of Tijuca, Rio de Janeiro, which is where I grew up. Ayowiri is a plant that grows abundantly in the tropical areas of the Americas. During the European occupation of the continent, an infusion of this plant was often used as a contraceptive and in stronger doses as an abortifacient by enslaved indigenous and African peoples, a strategy of what I see as radical care and a form of resistance in face of the impossible necropolitics of enslavement. I first came across this plant years ago when I was in the middle of my PhD research. And I've become a bit obsessed with it since. I first came across it looking at historical documents. I found the description of the use of this plant, this use that I just told you about, in the work of Maria Sibylla Merian, a Dutch-German woman who traveled to the Americas to do research, actually. She was, depending on who you ask, she was either the first or one of the first European women to travel to the Americas to do this kind of research. Because of that, she is also often seen as a kind of feminist icon. And actually, her face used to be in the mark bills, German marks, before they were substituted by the euro. What remains unsaid, however, in her account and even in how many people engage with her work was that Maria Sibylla Merian learned of this use of the plant through the people that she herself enslaved. So I've been so fascinated with this complicated history of this plant for so long, but it took me forever to realize that I knew this plant from my own life in Rio. I walked under their shadows and I heard their leaves rustling and I seen their flowers bloom, all without knowing of their deeply subversive nature. I was so marked by how these plants grew around the police battalion when I figured that out. I mean, during the Brazilian military dictatorship, which ruled the country between 64 and 85, that complex, was the local headquarters of DOI-CODE, the intelligence and repression agency of the regime. Within the white walls of that complex, countless people were brutally tortured, murdered, disappeared. A history that is yet unfinished, a wound that has yet to heal in a country unwilling to face its own brutality. While I conceived this film, I had a dream about my grandmother, an extraordinary, progressive, incredible woman who learned herbal medicine from her mother, my great-grandmother. We were very close, but unfortunately, I did not learn herbal medicine from her. My mother didn't learn either. Growing up during the industrialization, so-called, of Brazil meant that these knowledges became more and more distant from the reality of my generation and my mother's generation. In my dream, my grandmother was the tree, and she communicated with me through her rustling leaves, and I had to learn how to move my fingers and how to move my body in order to talk to her too. The film engages with these entangled, complex aspects, recent aspects of Brazilian history, linking it to this broader history of colonialism and of violence, but also, I don't know, it's such a painful history, but the fact that this continues to grow, that this continues to exist, is so hopeful for me. And we're talking about difficult histories, but there's also so much joy and beauty in organizing and resisting. This is a project that I did last year as part of a web residency with Schloss Solitude. In it, I wanted to explore the idea of writing an essay through gifts and to engage with practices of herbal birth control and the transmission of these knowledges as acts of radical and decolonizing care. And this project engages with the stories of ayurveda and other contraceptive and abortifacient plants, and looks into the idea of radical decolonizing care. And I've tried to unravel kind of the poetic dimensions of excess and this weird, fast-paced pluriverse meshing together perceived pasts, presents, and futures. This project is called All Directions at Once because I understand it as a kind of disjointed collective moving in all directions at once, all temporalities at once. Another work that I have done during this time is this performance. In it, I cooked and served a dinner of traditional Brazilian dishes, which are prepared with ingredients that I see to kind of lead a double life. They are known food sources, but they're also part of herbal preparations used for birth control and abortion. Now, plants have many, many different parts, and each part of a plant has a different effect, and which is also altered by the way that it is prepared, by the way that it is handled. So when I'm saying that I cooked and served a dinner with these plants, it doesn't mean that it was a dinner to actually do abortions or a dinner that would affect people in this sense. It was meant to begin a conversation about also the multiple facets of these plants. And since I used all of these family recipes because also I wanted to explore this notion of care and its relationship to nourishment and to the act of sharing a meal. So these dishes are safe. They're not meant to provoke any adverse effects. And also, one thing that I always like to say in these presentations, herbal medicine is a serious deal. You cannot just waltz in, take a bunch of grass and think you're gonna do something. You need, these are knowledges that stem from years of study and years of engagement with plants and with their processes. So I'm not gonna give recipes for anyone, that's what I'm trying to say. So yeah, anyway, these dishes are safe. They're not meant to provoke any adverse effects on those pregnant or those who are planning a pregnancy. Rather, they're meant to nurture, really, these conversations on the medicalization of bodies, on these notions of radical care, and really on the poetic dimensions of herbal remedies, and to be an encouragement to think about the recentering of indigenous and folk knowledges. In the dinner, as I said, I prepare foods and dishes that I grew up eating and share that with the public. And this dinner is also accompanied by a poetic reading where some of these threads are unraveled through the stories, a semi-fictional story of a garden of abortifacient plants located in the Quinta do Boa Vista Park in Rio. This park was originally Tamoio land, which later became Jesuit property and later was bought by a slave owner, a slave trafficker named Elias Antônio Lopes. When the Portuguese family ran away from the Napoleonic invasions and transferred their entire court to Brazil, Lopes gave that land and the palace that he had built upon it to the Portuguese crown. So that palace, that park, became the seat of the Portuguese Empire. That same palace later on became the National Museum of Rio, which you might have heard was almost completely destroyed in September 2018 by a huge fire. I almost feel like I want to do the performance here right now because to me it's such an interesting history. And that park, it's also very close to where I grew up, and it has gone through so many different phases throughout my life. I've seen that park in early childhood. I remember that park being a place where there was a zoo and where we would be taken during the weekend. And then after a few years, it kind of fell into disrepair, and it was the place where your parents told you not to go because it was dangerous, because people were doing drugs there, and all kinds of things. Right now, it has been somewhat revitalized. I don't know what's going to happen now because with the current situation in Brazil and in Rio specifically. But to me, that is such a charged space with that history. And anyway, in this performance and in this text that I have during the dinner, that I performed during the dinner, I look into these threads that trace such a complicated history of colonialism and of the production of knowledge tied to that place. These narratives that I am talking about during the performance unfold through the eyes of two women named Julia and Julieta, who first start sowing this garden at the beginning of the 20th century. And the narrative stretches until the night of the fire. And especially after seeing Tabitha's talk earlier today, where she mentioned how someone told her that there is a difference between looking at knowledge as production and looking at knowledge as cultivation. I felt that it resonated so much with what I'm thinking about also, and specifically what I'm dealing with in this performance, where these women plant this garden and sow and take care of this garden right outside of these walls of a museum and a building and a space that has been associated with colonialism, with the history of colonialism in Brazil, but that recently also was the site of people who were researching, who were doing actual decolonial research. So yeah, it is a very, very charged and frankly quite an emotional performance too. So anyway, through these works, what I'm interested in is really establishing dialogue and to think in terms of open-ended scenarios and to understand that notions of time and of knowledge are multifaceted. The notion of what is present, past, and future in one context may not be the same in another. This approach is very inspired by the Mexican Zapatista Liberation Front. The movement proposes radical strategies of resistance to the domination of colonized peoples, aspiring to what they call the creation of un mundo donde quepan muchos mundos, a world where many other worlds fit. And more than anything, the decolonizing work that I engage in, together with various allies and comrades, because also decolonizing work is never, ever solo work, means knowing that the changes that we're working towards, the changes that we want to see in the world will likely not come in our lifetimes. But it also requires you to be humble enough to understand that this is no reason not to continue in this struggle. Decolonizing work is never over, but it is a matter of survival. And throughout all of this, decolonizing work is also full of joy. The joy of sharing and building a vision of a world with many futures. The joy of finding allyship and solidarity. The joy of community building, sometimes even in the most unexpected of places. The joy of being there for each other, and the joy of understanding that we are fundamentally connected in this struggle. So, thank you.
Thank you so much, Luiza, for the fantastic presentations. And I want to admit that I was also personally, if you allow me, very touched by it. And I think it brings along other presentations here during the festival, also some very urgent and very political questions into the discussion. I have to think, for instance, about Emilia Sanabria's presentation on ayahuasca. And I also have to think about Kaushik's intervention in the opening ceremony, where you said that we have to think about, when we have this title, Bodies in Trouble, about the exploited bodies, right, and the marginalized bodies as well. And also I have some memories of our conversation we had before when we were preparing your intervention here, when we discussed how can we connect different systems of knowledge, right, and have a respectful discussion without appropriating it, without exploiting this knowledge. How could this work? I think this is a very important aspect also in your practices. And also maybe as a third aspect, an idea that came to my mind because I was watching your slides, of course, the images, how can we find also images and you know, narratives and representations of these topics. And before opening up, because I can imagine that there are some urgent questions, could you tell us a bit more about your future projects or what your research is right now? You have this residency, and we were talking about that you're preparing also a new project which kind of tries to dig deeper into these subjects. Could you tell us a little bit more about this?
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Right now in the Willem Flusser residency that I'm doing, I'm working on this project called the Councils of the Pluriversal. I don't know, it's really funny. Sometimes you name a project because you need to send an application and you have no idea what you're doing. I mean, you kind of have an idea, but what I want to say is, it sounds so presumptuous. I kind of love-hate the title. Anyway, essentially, the fundamental idea for this project was triggered a lot by some recent writings in feminist, some recent questions that have emerged in feminist discourse that have bothered me very much, actually. And I had a very interesting conversation with Emilia, who's present here, about it the other day. Basically, I am very angry at Donna Haraway. If you have read, sorry? So, yeah. So if you, I don't know if you're familiar with some of her latest work, specifically Staying with the Trouble, and I think maybe a concentration of that is found in a book called Making Kin, Not Population, which she edited together with Adele Clark. Haraway, as we all know, she is a major name in feminist and queer discourse. And as such, there is an amount, a certain responsibility that comes with that. And I have been very troubled I did that. I have been very troubled to see how figures like Haraway and Clark have bought the idea that climate change is intrinsically linked with overpopulation. Remember what I was talking about earlier, about Puerto Rico, about, I mean, you look at the history of suppression or monitoring, surveillance of fertility, and it is a history of the surveillance of fertility of marginalized people. Nobody is ever saying that white people are having too many babies. That conversation is always targeted towards the global south, always targeted towards people of color. And to see, I mean, I expect that from the right, but to see supposedly progressive thinkers buying into that and propagating that is maddening, to be honest. And it is also not only dangerous for the well-being of so many people in a direct way, that, you know, whose fertilities can and whose bodies will directly be affected by the policies that can come out of this, but also it doesn't help with the actual causes for the climate crisis. So yeah, in this project, I'm looking into that, and this pompous, weird name refers to, so I got angry at that, but again, I try to contain my anger and focus on resistance and focus on what things that already exist and that people are already doing that are independent from these people saying these stupid things. So in the beginning, in this project, I'm probably getting ahead already of the questions maybe, but in the beginning of this project, the idea was to essentially convene a series of conversations and yeah, to really go and talk to several people and in several different places about these issues and about the relationship that they have with the environment and with fertility and with reproduction. But then I realized that it was extremely presumptuous of me to, first of all, name this thing and assume that I'm convening something that is new. People have done this forever. This doesn't need me to happen. So as part of the project, I am, you know, I still want to, and I still will go and talk to a few people, but I'm also including a lot of archival research in this project, and which is also a way of me, a way that I found to question this idea of where the future comes from. So I'm looking, and I've been super happy to be in conversation with Dagmar Schulz and Ika Marshall. They were friends of Audre Lorde's. I went to Audre Lorde's apartment. Sorry, I get emotional just thinking about it. They were friends of Audre Lorde when she lived in Berlin. And they produced a documentary about her Berlin years, which I strongly recommend you watch. And they have such a beautiful, it's really a labor of love. There's no other way to put it. They have put together an archive of Audre's notes and conversations, and Dagmar had the habit of filming a lot of the things that they did. So there's footage of everything from parties, which, by the way, parties with Audre Lorde in the 80s could be in Berlin 2019. People still dress the same. Impressive. But yeah, there's everything from footage of parties to letters to notes. And so I'm talking to them and going through that archive because Audre was concerned with these issues too. She has a beautiful poem that talks precisely about population called Thanks to Jesse Jackson. And that kind of put me down that path. So in Berlin, I'm looking into that. But also in August, I'm going to Brazil. And in this case, looking at archives in Brazil is also, there's a different kind of urgency there, because with the current government that we have in Brazil, one of the things that fascist governments really like to do is to mess with history. And so I am very eager to go to Brazil. I'm going through the National Archive in Rio and other smaller archives to look into these kinds of gatherings and to see if I find documentation of people discussing these issues already. And I'm specifically also very interested in the history of resistance to the dictatorship. And yeah, so I'm gonna go through that.
Thank you. Maybe one last question before opening up for your questions and ideas and remarks, if you want to share with us. In your presentation, you referred to the notion and the idea of radical care, right? In different interventions that you described. Could you tell us a bit about your understanding of this notion of radical care and what role it does play in your practices?
Mm-hmm. So, this notion of radical care, I think I have managed to figure out where it came from, actually. As I mentioned during the presentation, a lot of this work that I've been developing is also very personal and very connected to personal family histories and the way that people in my family have had to deal with questions of reproduction and how it's affected all of us. So my grandmother, whom I mentioned, she had an abortion during the dictatorship. She was extremely Catholic, and having this abortion was something that was very difficult for her because it went against everything that she was taught that she could do, that she was allowed to do. But she had 10 children already and no way of taking care of all those children. And she decided that an abortion would be the best thing for her at that time. And she went to a neighbor, and that neighbor helped her in the middle of the dictatorship. That neighbor knew how to use plants because my grandmother learned how to use plants from her mother, but she did not learn recipes for abortion precisely because it was something that she thought was a sin. And thinking about the care and the solidarity that that neighbor, whom I don't know, I have never met. I don't even know the name of this person. But what this person did helped her create a new world, in a way, and a new future. So yeah, I think that's kind of where it comes from.
Thanks. And I think with this, we can open up to your questions. Please feel free to participate, of course, in our conversation, in the discussion. Are there any questions from your perspective? Would you like to share any ideas or comments or remarks with us?
Hi. I am Dutch, and I never heard about this history, so thank you.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. We are not taught about slavery on school at all, with our total history of colonialism, so that's something not new, but this is very new. What do you think from your perspective, because you are a part of colonialism, of course. From my point of view, I'm also part of colonialism. I don't know whether or not my grandparents were part of it, but in the archives it's probably to find. How can, for example, me, I'm not a researcher or an artist, I'm a lecturer, but our community as researchers and lecturers help you?
Sorry?
How can we as Dutch researchers or lecturers help you in this?
That's incredibly broad.
Yeah, it is, but you open something up and we can learn from that. And maybe we can, from our perspective, also give you something back from our archives or our sources. That's the question, more or less. Participation.
I think that specifically the Netherlands, I don't know, one thing that I tend to say to curators and to researchers that are white and that want to somehow get involved and to engage with these questions is, first of all, look at your own backyard. Because so often I see curators inviting people of color from abroad to go and talk or exhibit or whatever at their institutions, while artists of color from that place don't get access to that same institution and to those same things. And I've seen that so many times. And I mean, there's a huge community of color in the Netherlands. And I think it's fundamental because if you keep bringing people from abroad only, you're not going to shift the deeper structures that exist, that are in place there. So I think, I don't know, that's like the first suggestion that I would give, really.
Maybe if you allow me to add, from my personal perspective, I cannot, of course, speak for the reality in the Netherlands, but here in our region and in Germany, and I have the impression that this discussion about the history of Germany as a colonizer is just starting, right? It started a couple of years ago, and I have to think also about the power structures, right? And the power structures in the institution are still there, right? They are very, very homogenic, and they do not like kind of reflect the diversity that we have right now in our societies. It's very homogenic, and if you ask who makes the decisions, then there's the answer. And I think that we have to fight these power structures and change it, right?
Yeah.
Thank you for the lecture. I enjoyed it a lot. My question is also because my family is a part of this Dutch colonialism, but on the other side, not on the white side, sondern on the black community in Suriname. But we also worked in an earlier project on the question, how can you get into the history of which is not told? And what I had the experience, because I worked on a photograph of my grandmother, so she was, or ex-grandmother, she was ex-slavery, so it was showing a garment. I didn't know what it means, and I tried to search, but there was no archives. There was no history. There was nobody in the Dutch who was really interested in the female history. So what I question you, because you said you want to go through the archives to find something, but I said a lot of the stories are not saved into the archives, because as Satya Hartman said, yeah, it's paternalistic and white, mostly the archives. So what do you think would be other alternatives, strategies for this kind of knowledge production?
Thank you. That's an amazing question. I've been dealing with a lot of the same things. I mean, there is a lot of silence and a lot of suppression in relation to even these knowledges about herbalist practices and birth control and abortion. And my strategy so far has been looking into all these personal histories and actually talking to people and actually engaging with people and hearing what they know about their histories and hearing what they have to say. And I've done that a lot within my family for these works that I showed. And very recently, I came across this work by Vaginal Davis. Do you know her? She's an amazing artist and performer. And what she said, it was a portrait. It's a series that she's doing called Portrait of Something Ladies. I'm not going to remember it exactly right now, but it really struck me what she said in the description of that work, because she wrote that gossip is the archive and archive is infinite. And to me, it was so interesting to read that and to think about that. People talk about things. People have knowledges in them, and people carry those things with them. And yeah, so that has been my strategy, because of course, the archive is guided and governed very often most often by these very hegemonic notions of what knowledge is and what knowledge is valid. So, and that's, yeah, the piece that I mentioned, the dinner piece, deals exactly with that. The archive is what they do, what they're doing in that garden. That is their archive. That is the act of planting seeds and tending to that space and doing that. That is the archive that they're creating. And yeah, that's kind of how I've been dealing with it.
Thank you, Luiza, for that extraordinary presentation, and I'm feeling very moved by what you've just said. And I wanted to go back to Quinta da Boa Vista because I knew some of the history, but not all the history, and the personal piece you bring into that, and of course the fire that was recent and that was so powerful for the loss that represented, but also the anthropology department and all of that story conjured into that one place. And my question was about the caveat that you had as you were presenting this performance of the abortifacient dinner. And I wanted to sort of just raise this question with you about how, I guess it's botanical knowledge, right? That is, we find in the early medical anthropology sort of canon this question about, oh, but this is weird. This plant has all these very different, apparently contradictory, functions, and around the sort of the abortifacients, the amenagogues, and the menstrual regulators, and in the history and in the ethnography, there is a sort of there is a paradoxicality in that bringing on menstruation is also stimulating fertility, but also potentially creating an abortion, and the sort of and so there's a way in which the whole history that you've recounted around excess and around control and around empire and the control of reproduction is a story about controlling these plants and their uses and making demarcations that are of a colonial nature in the actual function of these substances, which were actually much more fluid because the same plant would be used at different moments in a woman's life to perform different fertility functions that could be on either end of this spectrum. So there's a way in which it's interesting that you're forced in that moment of this performance in this very situated context to have to sort of go, oh, but I'm not doing what because that shows how that sort of the power of that inscription, right, carries through in how we're told what plants do as if it's a singular sort of outcome function. So I just wanted to sort of ask you how you felt about that, because it connects so profoundly to what you're trying to open up, which is about embodied everyday practices with plants, which get at something completely different.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting that this is a question that comes up again and again. So often when I'm doing, as I mentioned, these presentations, or when I'm talking about my work in different capacities, people ask me, do you have a recipe? And I think very often that is a reflection, even when people don't have bad intentions, but that is a reflection of how these practices are not seen as valid, solid, actual knowledge. You would never ask a doctor, can you show me how to do knee surgery real quick? You would never ask a doctor that. Why would you ask that from herbalists? So I think it betrays a kind of disregard to that knowledge. And it's a very telling question, I think.
I think we have time for one last question before we have to conclude. Is there one more question or comment? Okay, if not, I would like to thank you, Luiza, and yeah, thank you very much.